The corporate media and the industry are saying CO2 is dropping. Does the scientific community have data on methane, whether methane is increasing, and also is CO2 really dropping?
You want to take it first?
Yeah, why don't we start here and then we'll...
Let me take that. The CO2 concentrations are not going down at all. So it's the rate, what the claim is the rate of which it's increasing may have slowed. And I think that's true, but I think it has more to do with recession than anything else, and there's several reports saying that when you look at the data. Methane, curiously, went up. I mean, it was steady for 1,000 years or so. It went up with the start of the Industrial Revolution exponentially. It slowed a little bit after World War II. It went back up. It's leveled off in the atmosphere from about late 1998, say, till about 2004 or so, and it's been going up again since then, fairly rapidly again. And I will tell you, neither I nor anyone else in the world can tell you why. There are many, many different sources of methane. There are climatic drivers behind the natural sources. There are feedbacks to increase some of those. There's a lot of argument about what's going on, but it is going up, and we need to get it down. That's the bottom line. We do know that in the United States, the natural gas industry is by far the single largest source. That we know. Cattle and other poultry industries, livestock are the second, but we need to get those under control as well.
Thank you. Quick response?
Well, I don't have the numbers that he has to give you, but I can tell you that with CO2 emissions, that we've had higher CO2 levels at previous times in our world history. That's a fact. And I can also tell you that when CO2 goes up, one of the things that's not being mentioned here is what does CO2 do? It encourages plant growth. What does plant growth do? Plants are carbon sinks. So what you have is a balancing type of thing. If you have more carbon, you will have more plant growth. When you have more plant growth, you'll have more carbon sinks. There's a self-balancing aspect to some of this stuff. That's about all I have to say.
We'll alternate between you. We'll let you respond and then we'll let her respond.
Just to say that I teach a graduate course in biology chemistry, which I've taught here since 1927. I know. There's a tremendous amount of complications in the feedbacks of the CO2 system, but it's far, far more complicated than you say, and the situation is far more scary than we seem to think.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the methane. And first, as far as the natural gas industry in the United States goes, I used to work in production engineering, and I did that for about a decade. And I can tell you that the numbers that Dr. Howard has put in his paper just are nonsensical, because there's no pumper, and pumper is a person who actually works on a well and drives a truck up to work on a well, you'd have to have a death wish to have the kind of methane volume that he attributes to the wellhead and to the facilities, because you blow yourself up if you were to approach a well and try to work on it. So, and he has been disproven on that by not only other universities, but also the government, industry, worldwide organizations. I mean, it's the amount of papers that have been issued since he issued that paper that have contradicted it are substantial.
Thank you.
I'm a graduate student and instructor of a course here at Cornell, some of my students here, on the issue of natural gas development, or fracking, as you may say. I'll also do my PhD research on it, and working for Cornell Cooperative Extension, doing some outreach on the issue. And you spoke to several issues today, all of you, on environment, health, wildlife, global climate change, economics. And there's also many other issues, many on the social side, which maybe weren't addressed today. But my question for you is, if you take all of these things, the title, I saw a poster for this event, and the title was, "Should we lift the ban, fracking?" And so thinking holistically, how do you take these non-commensurate values? How do you take a certain unit of effect on global climate change and combine it with an effect on economy, with an effect on human health and wildlife? How do you put those together to come up with a solution for should we lift the ban? And I find it very difficult to believe that everything is good or that everything is bad on this issue. So how do you combine those values?
Why don't we start on the far side and then...
I think my simple answer to that, and maybe it doesn't, reach the ethical standards or reach the standards a lot of people look for, but, I look at it more from the opinion of where am I going? And I have children, I have a daughter in college and a son in school, and what I look at is what do I want to provide for them? Okay, and I see where I've come from, and I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is still mill town. And every summer we'd go to the offices of the steel mill and we'd get free paint. The reason we got free paint is we were allowed to paint our houses. The reason our houses were covered was all the pollution coming out of steel mills. Well, a lot of that has changed. It's changed because the Industrial Revolution has really died down in this country, but it also has changed because what we have is a much more regulated environment for operations. Those emissions have been taken away due to regulation. So I believe, okay, when you talk about the social impact and the environmental impact, the whole concept here is understanding that energy is key to us moving forward, but we can't go backwards. We have to move forward. Regardless of whether it's solar, wind, natural gas, coal, whatever, we have to figure out a way to develop it, okay? Meet the obligations of moving forward in society and do it with minimal impact. But everything's going to have an impact, and that's one of the points I come from. Everything we do has an impact. Us sitting in this room has an impact. So what we have to look at is where do we want that impact to take us?
Respond.
I make a point, there are many sociological issues we did not get into, and I'm sure you're aware of Jeffrey Jacquette's work out west assessing that. So many residents who live in gas-flowing areas report they're less happy than they were, that lower quality of life than they used to have. So a lot of things that get wrapped up in this decision. And also make sure it's clear, it's not a trade-off between environmental issues and economic issues. My point is that I think there are economic issues proceeding with gas drilling. So for me, it is not time to lift the ban, because the whole array of issues between the sociological ones, the environmental ones, and the economic ones suggest that we are not ready to do this. I agree that we need energy and figure out ways to move forward. This is not the way. We're already showing ourselves, we're shooting ourselves in the foot to burn more carbon-based fuels. As I was pointing out, if we harvest this resource and even begin to use the volume we talked about in the EID report, the planet will get too warm.
I was going to note that, in fact, there's an enormous amount of pressure on Governor Cuomo to start the supplemental generic environmental impact statement proceeding all over again, and in fact, that's potentially very likely. The key thing is it was based on a false and misleading assertion, quote, as a result of New York's rigorous regulatory process, the types of problems reported to have occurred in states without such strong environmental laws and rigorous regulations haven't happened here, close quote. That's why it's called a supplemental generic environmental impact statement, because the assertion was that the 1992 generic environmental impact statement had prevented any health or environmental hazards. So the bottom line is that this revised draft has already started over once as a result of an executive order adopted in 2010. And the recent revised draft received more criticism than the original draft. So you can look at the Environmental Protection Agency's withering criticism. Just an enormous amount of technical concerns spelled out, and until all of those issues are fully resolved, it's going to be very hard to go forward with lifting the moratorium on shale gas fracking in New York.
I just want to add, I think what Walter's talking about is death by delay. And in fact, that's a problem our country has. We're acting on the precautionary principle, which is to eliminate all potential risk before we do anything. That isn't the real world. That isn't the real world. You know, there's a risk when you came here to this meeting. There's a risk when you got in your car. There's a risk in every single thing you do. And if we paralyze ourselves to the extent that we aren't willing to do anything, then where are we going? Where are we going? There has to be some reason and some judgment. And I think the way to do it is to have some continuous evaluation and improvement. And we've seen that. I've seen tremendous technological improvements over the last 4 years since I've been involved with this. Tremendous technological improvements. And nobody can deny them at this table that there's been tremendous improvements. that's what happens when you dig in and start doing something and evaluate.
Thank you. Okay, States, just sort of where you come to this discussion, what your opinions are.
Hi, I'm Hannah Fowler. I'm a student here. I've taken several environmental science and communications courses, and I live in upstate New York. Both sides today presented a lot of research that you freely stated were based on estimates and not enough facts. I'm wondering how long it's going to take before enough research is developed that you can give a concrete answer on this. Additionally, I'd like to know who would be funding that research.
You want to start with
Let me start with the methane emission side of it, because there is no one out there making methane emission estimates until our paper came out and highlighted the need. There are a bunch of groups now. The NOAA group, University of Colorado collaboration started right away. They put out a paper, as Bill mentioned, showing higher methane than we ever predicted. They continue to work. There's a new group at Purdue that's flying airplanes over, looking at plumes rising up into the air much larger than my friends tell me could happen because of safety reasons, but the airplanes are showing that. There's a group at Duke and Boston University looking at urban emissions. There's a group here at Cornell looking at urban distributions. We are looking at the gas field things. There's a bunch in the Netherlands. So I'm aware of about 25 different operations around the world where people are going out into the field and measuring the methane emission side of it. Who's funding it? Well, here in the United States, so far it is funded largely by industry. Mayor Bloomberg has funded it. Cornell, I'm proud to say, has funded our work because they think it's important. Purdue has funded their work. Penn State has funded work. So far, the federal agencies are a little bit slow to get involved, and I think they should. Lack of curiosity.
Thank you. Response?
We have 2.5 million wells that have been drilled in the United States. 1 million of those have been drilled in Texas. There is a lot of, there's a lot of ways to look at the oil and gas industry, but I think what you have to understand is it started in 1821 in New York with natural gas. It progressed to Pennsylvania in 1858. The New Yorkers drilled both of those wells. The first one was dug, the second one was drilled. Since then, and the total well count figure that I gave you was since 1949, 2.5 million wells. The oil and gas industry is a quintessentially American creation. And all the technology, most of the innovation, I can't say all, but nearly all. Most of the people that initially started in it, it came out of America. So we have a long, long history in this country. It may not feel like that here in Tompkins County, but the truth of the matter is that there are about 15 states or so that have a lot of experience with oil and gas production. Pennsylvania, but theirs wasn't very recent. And one of the reasons Pennsylvania got into some problems when they first started with the Marcellus was because they had old regulations. And a lot of it was needed to be updated. And when they got started, they saw what needed to be updated. They made the changes and moving forward.
Thank you. And I understand that this side wants to say something about that.
I mean, I would note that I think today there was a $4.2 billion settlement because of a massive contamination problem associated with oil drilling. So the bottom line is that this industry has problems. And the beauty of what's going on in New York is that we are the real world, and we are going to learn from states that have had tragedies. So in Pennsylvania, when they started fracking, they had all that gas drilling wastewater to get rid of. They just dumped it into mine voids. They dumped it into wastewater treatment plants and couldn't handle it. That's how they had the problems. So in New York, we have an opportunity, I believe, for the first time in the history of our nation's long history of extraction mining, to do it right, to impose strict liability, to make sure that if there are victims, heaven forbid, they're made whole. And that's how come there's so many tens of thousands of people have participated in this supplemental generic environmental impact statement proceeding, and I invite all of you to do so. It's your future. If you are from upstate New York, you have a vested interest in making sure that if the moratorium is ever lifted, it's going to provide full backstop, bulletproof protection, no excuses.
Yeah, I'll give him a chance as well.
I'd just like to make a comment that, one of the things you have to realize is New York imports in excess of 95% of its natural gas. Okay, so if Waller says, if we don't do it here, it's still going to be done. mean, New York, if you want to try to shut down that system, then write to Governor Cuomo and tell him you want nothing using natural gas in the state. That's the proper method to do it, because otherwise you're a hypocrite. So think about the opportunity. Like I said, this isn't an all or nothing. The environmental side, the other side, we have to look at this as an opportunity to work together and do it right, because we got to move forward, not backward.
Okay.
I'm a person and I'm interested in leading a healthy life. The oil and gas industry would like us to believe that they can extract the gas without polluting our air and water. At the same time, they insist that they have to be exempt from all clean air and clean water laws. In 2005, they spent enough money to get Congress to give them their wish, and they are now exempt from all clean air and water laws. If they really believe what they're saying, why would they do it? It's bad PR for them. So this indicates to me that either they cannot do it safely, or they do not want to do it safely, because it will cut into their profits.
Okay. Why don't we start quickly on that side and then come back over there?
That is, the answer to that is too long. I've got a handout for you. But just to put it in perspective, it's 2 pages and it shows everything that the oil and gas industry is regulated by. The oil and gas industry is regulated by U.S. Clean Water Act, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. EPA, Delaware Susquehanna River Basin Commission, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, and then there are additional state and local agencies that regulate. Oil and gas is highly regulated. I think the thing that is getting lost in this conversation is that, we started on this really stacking the energy supply a long time ago, and those of us that are my generation remember in the 70s when we first got clean air and clean water, and we also remember the oil price shocks in the 70s and how that restacked the supply deck and really made this incentive to look for alternatives. What has happened in the intermediate 40 years, we really haven't found much except for nuclear power. So we want to get away from hydrocarbons, which are the underpinning for all fuel sources except for wind, solar, geo, hydro, and nuclear. But everything else, whether it's wood, biomass, coal, oil, gas, everything else, if it's ethanol, switchgrass, doesn't matter. It's all hydrocarbon. And the reason is because breaking that carbon-hydrogen bond produces so much energy out of such a small package that it's almost impossible to get away from. And even, we've been talking about this IEA study. I mean, we're talking about changing 85% hydrocarbon to maybe 80% hydrocarbon over the next 20 years because it's the fundamental energy unit out there.
Thank you.
So despite the litany of what you just brought up, the fact remains the oil and gas industry exempt from key provisions of about the 5 most major environmental regulations, and you're not seeing that.
I agree. I mean, much of what you're saying is misleading, and part of the problem, part of the reason people don't trust industry on this is that the natural gas industry has hired the same consulting firms, public relation firms who worked for Big Tobacco for the last 4 years. And they just spout misinformation left and right. It's hard to trust them. I'd love to be able to work with industry to do it right, but you can't when they prove so untrustworthy.
I was also going to note that the regulation of oil and gas drilling in New York is through the state of New York. So the feds don't issue the permits. But I invite you, go to toxicstargeting.com, click on the Marcellus Shale special section, look at the data yourself, read the documents yourself. These are government data. So in addition to the exception, there's just a fundamental lack of enforcement. There are 140,000 leaking tanks and spills in New York that don't meet applicable standards. Southern Cuco Lake doesn't meet the applicable standards. There's huge lack of enforcement with regard to pollution control in New York. That's just the bottom line.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, Christine.